Hey everybody, so I wanted to do a quick Nowhere Land Q&A video. Nowhere Land, if you don't know, is my Chris Chan concept album, that progressive rock concept album that I wrote, recorded, and released earlier this year, built around the notorious, infamous, legendary internet personality that is Christian Weston Chandler. It's gotten a very strong and very positive response, and I really appreciate that. And if you haven't heard it yet, I strongly encourage you to go check it out. It's available on every major streaming service. So anyway, got a user question. And by the way, there are a couple of user questions in the backlog that I still want to answer. And if you have any questions about it, feel free to send them in. I love talking about the work and kind of elaborating on things and everything. So if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. I have some questions in the backlog that I'm going to get to eventually, but this one seemed like one that was very pertinent and very worth answering right away. So I wanted to go ahead and get into it. It's a user named Eats a Lot of Puss. Says, enjoying the album, do you feel Nowhere Land is just a further exploitation of Chris? Either way, I like it and I'm on board. I am just wondering about the irony, parentheses, hypocrisy, question mark, of some of the lyrics. I am not very far in, so forgive me if this is addressed in the subject matter. It is addressed in the subject matter, but that's still a good question to talk about. And especially because it lets me talk about one very specific influence on the album. So first of all, the question of whether or not this was exploitative of Chris, I was something that was very much on my mind as I was doing this, as much as I had this great idea, this burst of inspiration, and got down to writing and recording and got into a lot of fun and excitement about that, I was also very conscious and very much of the mindset of not wanting to, of checking myself on like, wait, this is not a fictional person you've created. This is not a deceased person. This is a still living person, and think about how what you're saying affects them. And the most important thing in my mind, and what I put in the forefront of my mind, was that this has now gone into the realm of being a true crime story. This is not just me randomly coming up with something new and funny to throw at Chris Chan and get a response or something like that, like a troll. This issue has now moved into the realm of crime and public interest because of the criminal element of it. And so for that reason, I think that is what merits the discussion, especially from an artistic standpoint. Also because it was my intention to move forward with a very artistically minded tone. This is not meant to be mocking and ridiculing of Chris. There are sections where that occurs, though, and which is inevitable if you're going to tell the story of Chris. And so what I always made it a point to do was address anything that had to be addressed in a mocking or ridiculing tone. I wanted that to come from and be said by characters within the story, where trolls and people like that, where it would make sense for them to say those things. And for example, there's comic relief at one point in the form of the character Mad Dog Fuckface in the Morning, which is a fictional character meant to be a composite character of all of the radio DJs and podcasters and just scumbag internet personalities that were finding out about Chris and putting him, using him for cheap content on their shows and things like that. And certainly I don't mind directing absolute derision at somebody like that, somebody that's a contemptible slime bag anyway. I don't mind directing mockery and derision at someone like that, especially because even then it's not targeting a specific person, even though people have already been able to figure out, it was based on people like Tom Likas, people like Anthony Cumia and things like that, Opie and Anthony and all of that. The influences are obviously there, but it's not an actual specific person. So obviously I don't mind venting my spleen on a fictional punching bag that way. But anyway, the other thing was, so that was what I was very conscious of not putting anything in there in the actual narration, the actual tone of the album that was mocking of Chris. where, like I said, it has to happen from characters within the story that would have said those things anyway. And pertinent to that was I actually originally had a song that I'd written that was supposed to be about Chris meeting Megan Schroeder and falling in love, and it was called Gaming Store Girl. And I wrote the whole thing. I wrote Gaming Store Girl from beginning to end. I had the lyrics, chord progression, vocal melody. I had basically, those were the core components of the song. And I had written it. I knew what style it was going to be in. I was working on the arrangement and everything. And I started to demo it a little bit to start to get an idea of it. And as I was doing that, I ended up scrapping the song because I thought, this is purely mocking Chris within the actual narrative, making fun of Chris for falling in love, falling in what he thought was love, quote unquote love, with Megan Schroeder and all of that. This is purely making fun of Chris with no greater purpose, no larger satirical value, no greater insight to be had. So when it's something like that that's purely piggybacking on the public perception of Chris as a goober and a loser and all of that, that's when it was exploitative in a negative sense. To a certain extent, anything that exploits the value of the story around Chris Chan and the culture around him and everything is going to be exploitative in the strictest sense of the word. But in the toxic, negative sense of the word, that was where I drew the line. So I took that song Gaming Store Girl out, and I don't think I lost anything as a result. And that brings me to the next point, which is the idea. I knew that one of the best ways to do this in a constructive manner was to have the narrator of this story be a kind of a reformed troll that is seeing the errors of their ways. And that's why in the first song, the childish one, what are the lyrics? What have you done with the childish one? Was it all worth it, my friends? Are you now proud that you've made him a god? Would you baptize him again? The lyrics there are this person saying, oh my God, look at what this has come to, which is kind of where I was in reality too. But it was like, look at what this has come to. Was it worth it? Was it really worth it to get us to this point? And so throughout the narrative, the primary narrator is someone that is questioning themselves, questioning the people around them, as all of this is played into Chris, and questioning the world that brought us Chris Chan, which is what the song 90s Kids was about, and that theme comes up in other songs too. And it kind of comes full circle at the very end on the songs The End of the Circus and Dimensional Merge, the last track. And so and to the people who appreciate the Easter egg at the end, you're welcome. I thought that was very apropos. Anyway, so that was the main thing, was making sure that this narrative person was not the person delivering the derisive statements about Chris. That person who was creating the world of the story in this album always seemed remorseful. And that brings me to one of my big influences. And so people have been, and that's one thing I'm going to get to. There are some specific influences, like people have noticed that Marillion was a very strong influence, that Irion was a very strong influence. And so I want to address those, how those albums influenced me as a musician and this project in general. But one of the influences I want to talk about here is a Pink Floyd album that not a lot of people think of when they think of Pink Floyd. And, obviously you can hear the very strong Pink Floyd influence on this album. There's really no such thing as a prog rock album that's not influenced by Pink Floyd, but certainly I'm a huge Pink Floyd fan, and that influence is very much on display. And so you can certainly hear the influences of like the anguished wailing guitar solos and the angsty vocals and those dreamy keyboard synthesizer passages and everything. That influence is very much there. And certainly I think you can hear the influence of the three biggest Pink Floyd albums, The Wall, Dark Side of the Moon, and Wish You Were Here. That kind of influence is really up front. But one album that really influenced me on this is one that not a lot of people talk about or think about, and that's The Final Cut. The Final Cut was the final album that Pink Floyd did with Roger Waters before he quit the band for good. And one of the reasons it was met with mixed reviews when it came out for a few reasons. One, because a lot of people felt like correctly that it was really not a Pink Floyd album so much as a glorified Roger Waters solo album. And that's very much the case, because at that point, Roger Waters, despite being a musical genius, was very much in the position of Pink Floyd being his band and only his band, and he's basically coming in and saying, here's your part, here's your part, here's your part, and all of that. And so it's understandable why they wanted to part ways with him at that point. There's even a Pink Floyd interview where at that time where you can hear David Gilmour say he's glad that he finally got old rotten guts out of the band. So there's a lot of mutual contempt and all of that. But anyway, the other reason The Final Cut wasn't well received is it's a very political album, very politically oriented album, which was not something people wanted to hear from Pink Floyd. You know, the core Pink Floyd fan base wanted to put on Dark Side of the Moon and get lit up. You know, so it's hard to get high to The Final Cut. But anyway, as people grew up and matured, though, they were able to look back at The Final Cut and appreciate it in a newer and more, I guess, enlightened or informed context. But the closest thing to a political album that Pink Floyd had before that was Animals. And Animals is not a specific, it's not dealing with specific politics, it's dealing with socioeconomic politics in an abstract context, kind of like Orwell did with Animal Farm and that kind of thing. But The Final Cut is dealing with very specific issues, and it's dealing with the issue of Britain, of England, and the way it was floundering economically after World War II, and the way that the politicians at the time seemed more interested in just sending people off to war with less and less of a virtuous underpinning to their intentions, where there was no question in World War II who was on the side, or the people fighting felt they were on the side of right, and they were doing God's work, and they were doing the right and virtuous thing, and that all of that. And then you get into these more ridiculous politically motivated wars that really don't feel like something people want to fight for. And all of this is being in the album, The Final Cut, is being told from the perspective of a man who we find out through the music videos is actually the teacher from the movie version of Pink Floyd, The Wall. But this older man, middle-aged man, who is a World War II veteran, and he's watching the decline of England after World War II and everything in the decades following World War II, and just becoming disillusioned. We get the impression this is somebody that's a very strong, passionate patriot who no longer, feels like he's been let down by the people who he gave his patriotism to and everything. And that's kind of the narrator of The Final Cut, the album. And there's this refrain that keeps coming up. He keeps talking about Maggie. He says, "What have we done, Maggie? What have we done?" And the Maggie he's referring to is Margaret Thatcher. And so there's all of these great messages that are just these very deep messages in that album that are made with just a few sentences. One for example, in the Post-War Dream, forgive me for using the slur, but it's part of the lyrics. He says, at one point he says, if it wasn't for the Nips being so good at building ships, the yards would still be open on the Clyde, and it can't be much fun for them beneath the rising sun with all their kids committing suicide. And so what that's referring to, just in those few lines, is brilliant. First of all, because now, by the way, what that's referring to, the Nips, nip is a slur for a Japanese person. Nipponese is the correct linguistic vernacular in the Japanese language for a Japanese person. So anyway, it's a slur for that. But the point being that Japan, the economic bubble had not burst in Japan yet, and so Japan was just skyrocketing forward, and their economic growth was just going through the roof, and especially in the 70s, 80s, and so they were burying England in terms of economic output and that sort of thing. So the English were not, the English shipyards were closing because the Japanese were putting them out of business. And then it has that line, which that's what the first part's referring to. But then that second line where it says, it can't be much fun for them beneath the rising sun with all their kids committing suicide. And so the rising sun is a specific, it's the Japanese flag. But that expression refers to a specific version of the Japanese flag, which is it's the red circle with the red beams coming off of it, which is specifically associated with Japanese fascism. And what he's referring to there, during World War II, the Japanese were practicing kamikaze pilots, were practicing sending in kamikaze pilots, where they would send pilots with the intention of crashing their planes, and which was terrifying for anyone fighting against them, because one of the things you take into consideration strategically when you're fighting a war is the assumption that the other side wants to survive. If you can't intimidate them by speaking to their instinct for survival, then that kind of screws up a lot of strategy there. So there were the suicide pilots, the kamikaze pilots, but then on top of that, after World War II, in the aftermath of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the nuclear bombs and all of that, and this is a problem that persists in Japan to this very day, there are huge problems with depression in Japan. And suicide is a huge issue in Japan, especially the concept of karoshi, which is suicide by overwork, where people will work themselves to death. They will work so hard that they die of heart failure and things like that, or they work so hard that they end up in a suicidally depressed and end up committing suicide and that sort of thing. And so it's asking the question of, like, yes, you've got one of the dominant economic forces in the world, but at what cost? It's not improving your quality of life, is the point that he's making. Anyway, that's a wide derivation talking about the final cut, but that album, bringing it back around to Nowhere Land, that really spoke to me. That idea of a person that's become disillusioned with this thing they believed in, that was very influential on me from a narrative standpoint. And so from that perspective, doing it from that perspective, that's not a fake perspective, by the way. That is, even though I never took part in any trolling or bullying of Chris Chan, it's still something that I very much felt on an empathetic level. The idea of, what if you're someone that's taken part in this, and now you are looking back on almost 2 decades of this madcap insanity, and and seeing Chris arriving at this, at the point that he's at now, mentally deranged and a criminal and all of that. I also think there's a huge argument to be made that Chris Chan, in a lot of ways, kind of is the internet's Sid Barrett, but that's a topic for another video. Anyway, to Eats a Lot of Puss, thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying the album. I hope you enjoy it as much as Puss. But anyway, and if you haven't heard it yet, please check it out. And if you have any questions, feel free to send them in. I'll be glad to answer them. Peace.